On a cool April night in 2008, the sea outside Clearwater whispered against the shore, calm and indifferent, while fate waited in the shadows. In that quiet darkness, a young woman vanished without a trace. Her name was Emily Carter, a 20-year-old marine biology student whose smile lit every room she entered. After finishing her shift at a small coffee shop, she carried her familiar canvas bag, got into her silver car, and drove toward Honeymoon Island, a place she often visited for peace. That drive marked the last time anyone saw her alive. The next morning, her seat in class remained empty, her phone silent, and her dorm room untouched. What unfolded after that night would scar Clearwater for more than 15 years, leaving behind questions that shattered the comfort of a town that once believed it was safe. Why did Emily never return from that drive to the beach? Who was waiting for her in the shadows of Honeymoon Island that night? If you want to uncover these haunting questions, like this video, subscribe to my channel, Unscripted Tales, and let us reach 5,000 likes on this story to keep Emily's voice alive. Also, comment below and tell me from where you are watching this story right now. On April 12, 2008, Emily Carter left her part-time shift with her usual warmth, waving goodbye to her co-workers and the last few customers. She wore a pale blue blouse and simple jeans, her canvas shoulder bag hanging by her side. She looked like any ordinary student heading into an ordinary night. But by dawn, the ordinariness had disappeared. In her biology class, her chair was left empty. Friends expected her to walk in late with her bright laugh, but she never appeared. Her phone remained unanswered. By noon, the first hints of fear surfaced when her roommate reported that Emily had not come back to her dorm at all. That absence was unlike her, a girl known for her punctuality and dedication. Her parents, Thomas and Margaret Carter, sat in their modest home near Tampa Bay as the day stretched into anxious hours. They called friends, professors, and co-workers, desperately hoping she had simply fallen asleep somewhere else, but every call ended with disappointment. By evening, dread eclipsed hope. With trembling voices, they reported their daughter missing to the Clearwater Police Department. That phone call marked the beginning of a nightmare that would cast a shadow over their lives and over Clearwater itself for the next decade and a half. Emily Carter was more than just another student at the University of South Florida. She was known across campus for her kind spirit and the way her smile seemed to brighten even the dullest morning. Friends often said that Emily carried an energy that made people feel lighter simply by being around her. Professors admired her discipline and her deep love for marine biology, a subject she had chosen with passion rather than practicality. She often spoke about her dream of dedicating her life to protecting sea turtles and preserving fragile ocean habitats. Emily's fascination with the ocean began when she was a child. Growing up near Tampa Bay, she spent hours walking along the shore, collecting shells and studying crabs, with the curiosity of a young scientist. That childhood wonder never faded. Even as a university student, she still carried a small notebook in her worn canvas bag, where she jotted down thoughts, sketches, and observations about the sea. It was her way of connecting with the world she loved most. Her friends described her as ambitious, but never arrogant. Emily pushed herself to succeed, yet she always found time to help others. She volunteered at the campus marine lab, guided younger students with their assignments, and sometimes organized small beach cleanups with her classmates. She had a gift for turning serious responsibility into something joyful and inspiring. Home. She was the heart of her family. Thomas and Margaret, her parents, saw her as their pride and joy. Their only daughter who carried not only their hopes, but also their laughter. Emily often called her mother late at night to talk about her day, and she never missed family dinners when she came home from campus. To her parents, she was not just a daughter, but also a friend. She was equally cherished by her close circle of friends. Her roommate often joked that Emily's laughter could be heard down the hallway long before she opened the door. To many, she was a symbol of brightness, the kind of person people turned to for comfort and encouragement. And because she was so reliable and full of life, Her sudden disappearance did not just create fear. It tore a hole in the lives of everyone who loved her. Emily Carter's absence was not only about a missing student. It was about the loss of a soul who carried dreams of protecting the ocean, of making the world a kinder place. Her vanishing would soon reveal that even the most familiar smile can be stolen in an instant. Leaving behind questions no family ever wants to ask. What the Carters and the entire Clearwater community were about to discover on that first night of searching would change everything. On the evening of April 12, 2008, Emily Carter finished her shift at the small roadside coffee shop where she worked part-time. She waved goodbye to her co-workers with the same warmth she always carried, a soft smile that lingered in their memories long after she walked out the door. She was dressed simply, a pale blue blouse and faded jeans, with her canvas bag hanging from her shoulder. That bag, worn at the edges from years of use, carried a few of her books and a small notebook, where she often wrote down thoughts about the ocean. Emily got into her silver sedan and drove through the quiet Clearwater streets, the scent of salt drifting from the sea. Streetlights glowed dimly, casting long shadows along the empty road. She headed toward Honeymoon Island, a secluded beach where she often went to breathe and collect her thoughts. It was a place of calm for her, a retreat where the sound of waves seemed to steady her restless mind. No one could have imagined that her visit that night would end with silence that lasted years. The next morning, her absence quickly drew concern. In her biology class, her chair was empty. Friends waited, thinking she might rush in late, notebook in hand, but she never arrived. By midday, her phone remained unanswered, her dorm room cold and untouched. Her roommate grew anxious, knowing Emily's punctual nature made it unlikely that she would miss class or vanish without telling anyone. As hours passed, worry grew heavier. Her friends called her repeatedly, leaving unanswered messages. Professors began to ask questions. When evening fell, her parents, Thomas and Margaret, could no longer deny their dread. With hearts pounding, they dialed the Clearwater Police Department. Thomas's trembling voice told the officers that his daughter had not come home. That call shifted Emily's absence from worry to a full search. Police patrols were dispatched that same night. Officers retraced her usual route, from the coffee shop where she had last been seen to the roads leading toward Honeymoon Island. Flashlights cut across the sand, and the sound of radios crackled against the sea breeze. Every minute felt heavier, every empty stretch of road like a clue swallowed by darkness. Everyone searching knew time was slipping away, and every second mattered. Emily Carter's disappearance was no longer a matter of late arrivals or unanswered calls. It had become the beginning of a mystery that Clearwater would carry like a scar. What the officers discovered near the parking lot of Honeymoon Island would leave the entire community in shock. The search for Emily Carter stretched into the night, and by the time patrol officers reached the parking lot of Honeymoon Island, their flashlights fell upon something that froze them in place. There, in the corner of the lot, sat her silver sedan. The driver's side door was slightly open, and the keys were still in the ignition. On the passenger seat lay her familiar canvas bag, neatly resting as though she had stepped out for only a moment. It carried nothing unusual, just a few books, and her notebook. Everything about the scene suggested she had not planned to leave for long. Yet she was nowhere in sight, as officers expanded their search. Beams of light swept across the sand, revealing something unsettling. Just beyond the parking lot, the ground was marked with chaotic footprints, overlapping each other as if a struggle had taken place. Some impressions dug deep into the sand, showing panic and resistance. Not far from the disturbed ground, an officer bent down and picked up a piece of clothing caked with mud. It was a torn pair of jeans, and on the hem, faint but undeniable, was a stain of dried blood. The weight of the discovery shifted the case from a missing person to something far more sinister. Police secured the area, yellow tape fluttering in the sea breeze as red and blue lights flashed against the palm trees. The once quiet beach was suddenly transformed into a scene of fear. Residents who heard the news gathered nearby, whispering nervously, their voices heavy with disbelief. For many, It was unbearable to accept that the young woman who had smiled at them just the day before might have faced violence so close to home. The search pressed on with urgency. Canine units were brought in, and the dogs picked up Emily's scent, leading the officers across the sand toward the shoreline. The trail ended at the water's edge, where the tide had already begun to wash away any remaining traces. Divers entered the shallow waters, combing through the dark seaweed and debris, but they found nothing that gave answers. The waves continued their rhythm, as though erasing every sign of the struggle. By midnight, the search was forced to pause. Rising tides and low visibility made it impossible to continue. Officers returned to the lot, faces tight with the knowledge that precious hours had been lost. For the Carter family, who were waiting, with breaking hearts, the sight of their daughter's car, abandoned by the beach, was enough to shatter hope. Margaret collapsed at the hood, sobbing as Thomas stood still, staring at the footprints that told the story no parent ever wishes to imagine. Emily's car, her bag, the torn jeans, and the footprints in the sand created a picture of fear, but not of clarity. The one piece missing was Emily herself. The discovery left Clearwater shaken. But soon, the search for truth would bring the focus onto someone close to Emily's past. By the morning after Emily Carter's car was found abandoned at Honeymoon Island, word had already spread across Clearwater. Neighbors, classmates, and strangers gathered near the beach, their voices hushed and filled with unease. Some brought flowers, others held candles, and many simply stood in silence, staring at the waves as if the sea itself might give answers. A place once known for peace and sunsets had become a stage for fear and unanswered questions. Parents clutched their children closer, warning them not to go out alone at night, and whispers of suspicion drifted through the crowd. For Emily's parents, the grief was unbearable. Margaret collapsed at the sight of her daughter's empty car, her trembling hands pressed against the hood, as if holding on to the last trace of Emily. Thomas stood beside her, his face pale, his body rigid, as he stared at the footprints in the sand that told a story he wished he could erase. The couple was consumed by shock. Their home that once echoed with Emily's laughter now filled only with the sound of sobs and unanswered prayers. The community's response grew quickly. Prayer vigils were held on the sand, hundreds of candles, forming circles of light against the dark sea. Emily's friends wept openly, clutching one another, while professors spoke of her as a gifted student with a heart dedicated to protecting the ocean. Local news channels broadcast live from the beach, and newspapers across Tampa Bay ran headlines that carried her face across Florida. What began as fear now turned into collective mourning, with the entire community sharing in the Carters' sorrow. Yet, as days passed, unity began to fracture. Some believed Emily had been targeted by someone she knew, while others insisted a stranger must have been responsible. Speculations filled living rooms, campus hallways, and late-night conversations. Clearwater was no longer the calm coastal town it had always been. It was a community divided between grief and suspicion, between empathy and fear. The heartbreak was felt most deeply by those closest to Emily. But the shadow her disappearance cast touched everyone. It was no longer just the Carter family's tragedy. It became Clearwater's wound, one that no one could ignore. As vigils burned late into the night and the community cried for justice, detectives began to look closer at Emily's life and those who had been part of it, and soon one familiar name began to rise above all others. As detectives searched for answers in Emily Carter's disappearance, one name kept surfacing in their interviews. Friends, classmates, and even neighbors spoke of someone who had once been a very important part of Emily's life, her former boyfriend, Jason Miller. Jason was a 22-year-old business student at the same university. For more than a year, he and Emily had been seen as the perfect couple. They laughed together at campus events, studied late into the night, and often walked along the beach holding hands. But 3 months before Emily vanished, the relationship ended. The reasons for their breakup varied depending on who was asked. Some said Emily wanted to focus on her marine biology studies, while others believed jealousy and constant arguments had eroded their bond. What seemed clear was that Jason had struggled to accept the end. Just a week before Emily disappeared, one of her classmates remembered seeing the two of them arguing loudly outside a campus bar. Emily had insisted on moving on with her life, while Jason looked angry and unwilling to let go. That memory made investigators take a closer look at him. When detectives arrived at Jason's home, which he shared with his stepfather, they found him cooperative but visibly uneasy. Jason insisted he had nothing to do with Emily's disappearance. He explained that on the night she vanished, he was at home watching a basketball game, and only his stepfather could confirm his alibi. That explanation left a troubling gap, since it relied on the word of a single person closely connected to him. Suspicion grew quickly. Students whispered that Jason's anger might have driven him to do something reckless. Emily's friends were divided. Some said he still loved her deeply and could never harm her, while others pointed to his temper and the public argument as reasons to doubt his innocence. The Carter family, once fond of Jason, struggled with painful questions. Margaret remembered how she had once thought of him as a son, but now she could not silence the fear that he might have been the cause of Emily's tragedy. Police collected DNA samples from Jason and compared them to evidence taken from the torn jeans found near Emily's car. This test became a turning point. When the results came back, they confirmed that Jason's DNA did not match. The jeans carried no trace of him, and with that, the case against him began to collapse. Even though science cleared Jason, suspicion never fully left him. Whispers followed him through campus. Strangers cast accusing glances, and his name lingered. In hushed conversations, the pressure grew so unbearable that he eventually left Clearwater, unable to live under the weight of being tied to Emily's disappearance. Jason Miller's removal as the main suspect should have offered relief, but instead, it left everyone more unsettled. If not Jason, then who had taken Emily from Honeymoon Island? By the end of 2008, months after Emily Carter vanished from Honeymoon Island, the energy that had once fueled the search began to fade. Police had interviewed dozens of people, tested evidence, and followed every lead they could uncover, but each path ended in silence. No new witnesses came forward, no new evidence surfaced, and the sea seemed to guard its secrets tightly. With each passing week, the urgency that had shaken Clearwater slowly slipped into resignation. In October of that year, the words that the Carter family dreaded were finally spoken. Emily's case was declared a cold case. Those two words felt like a sentence. For Thomas and Margaret, it was as though the system had given up on their daughter while they were still clinging to hope. Their home remained filled with reminders of Emily, her open books left on the desk, her sneakers by the door, her laughter frozen only in photographs. Life outside continued, but within their walls time had stopped. The community that had once gathered in hundreds at vigils also began to move on. News articles that once filled the front page were now tucked into small corners of the paper, and television coverage dwindled to a brief mention on anniversaries. Neighbors who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with the Carters quietly returned to their routines. The silence of forgetting settled over Clearwater. But the pain inside the Carter home never softened. Still, Thomas and Margaret refused to surrender to that silence. Each year, they organized a memorial at Honeymoon Island, lighting candles in the sand as waves carried their prayers into the night. They posted flyers across town with Emily's smiling face, urging anyone with information to come forward. Margaret wrote letters to state officials and to the FBI, pleading for help, while Thomas spent long hours handing out flyers, telling strangers to remember his daughter's name. Their grief had become a mission to keep Emily's memory alive, in a world that seemed determined to move on. But while the Carters fought to hold on to hope, Clearwater itself was changing. For many, Emily's story became an old scar, spoken of only in whispers, a reminder of how fragile safety could be. The wound that remained for the family was unbearable, yet for the rest of the town, it was easier to let the memory fade. The Carters lived with an unshakable emptiness, believing that somewhere out there, the truth still existed. What they could not know was that a tiny fragment of evidence already held the answer. waiting for the day technology would finally be able to unlock it. For more than 14 years, Emily Carter's case sat in silence, marked only by yearly memorials and the tears of her parents. But in early 2023, a spark of hope suddenly returned. Florida had begun using advanced genetic genealogy, a new investigative method that allowed detectives to re-examine old DNA samples with technology far beyond what was possible in 2008. To most, this news was just another line in a newspaper. But to Thomas and Margaret Carter, it meant the possibility of answers after years of darkness. Investigators reopened the box of evidence collected the night Emily vanished. Among the items were the torn jeans found near her car, stained with mud and a trace of blood. In 2008, the DNA recovered had been too limited to identify anyone in the national database, but now, advanced sequencing allowed scientists to create a much more complete genetic profile, piece by piece, like fitting together fragments of a broken mirror. A picture began to form. When that DNA was compared to samples in public genealogy databases, it produced a partial match. The match was not to a direct suspect, but to a distant relative. Using this faint thread, forensic genealogists began to build a family tree. They followed branches across marriages and generations, narrowing it closer and closer to Clearwater. At the center of the tree, one name stood out: Mark Doyle. Mark Doyle was 52 years old, and in 2008, he had lived only 2 blocks away. From the Carter family, he was a quiet man, a repair technician who fixed air conditioners for neighbors, and someone who had no serious criminal record, only minor run-ins for small offenses. At the time, his name had never raised suspicion, but now, the genetic trail pointed directly to him. Detectives launched a quiet surveillance. They watched his routines, noted his movements, and waited for a chance to collect a fresh sample of his DNA. That opportunity came when Mark carelessly threw away a half-finished soda can in a public trash bin. Investigators retrieved it, rushed it to the lab, and waited anxiously for the results. When the comparison was complete, the answer was undeniable. The DNA on the can matched perfectly with the DNA from the jeans found near Emily's abandoned car. After 15 long years, the shadows finally revealed a name. The Carter family, who had carried grief like a weight every day, suddenly had both relief and horror. They finally knew who had been responsible for their daughter's disappearance. And yet, the truth was far closer than they had ever imagined. As news of the breakthrough spread, Clearwater braced itself for the moment when this hidden name would finally be confronted face to face. On a warm morning in July 2023, Clearwater residents woke to flashing headlines and breaking news broadcasts. Police cars had swarmed a small, rented house in the northern part of the city. There, after years of living unnoticed among them, 50-year-old Mark Doyle was handcuffed and led out in silence. Cameras captured his emotionless face as neighbors gathered in disbelief, unable to process that the man they had known for so long was now accused of murdering Emily Carter. The shock ran deeper when reporters revealed that Mark Doyle had not been a stranger lurking in the shadows during those early days of the search. He had joined the volunteer efforts in 2008, handing out flyers, walking the beach with flashlights, and even standing close to Emily's grieving parents during vigils. People remembered him as the quiet neighbor who offered water bottles to exhausted searchers and spoke words of comfort. To know that he had played the role of a helper while hiding the darkest truth left Clearwater stunned and furious. For the Carter family, the betrayal was almost unbearable. Margaret collapsed when she realized that the man who had once nodded sympathetically as she clutched a photo of her missing daughter was the very same man who had taken Emily's life. Thomas remembered letting him into their home once to fix their air conditioner, never suspecting that this ordinary-seeming neighbor carried such cruelty inside him. The realization tore at them, reopening wounds that had never healed. Clearwater itself felt deceived. Neighbors who had once asked Mark for small favors or shared conversations with him now recoiled at the thought of having lived beside a murderer. For years, the sense of safety that had been shattered in 2008 was now replaced by outrage. How could someone stand shoulder to shoulder with a grieving family, pretending to search, while knowing he was the reason for their suffering? The arrest brought relief, but it also uncovered a new layer of horror. Emily's killer had not been a faceless stranger. He had been among them all along, blending into the fabric of the community, quietly carrying a secret that had haunted the town for 15 years. As Mark Doyle sat in a cell, awaiting interrogation, the most chilling truth was still to come. Inside the interrogation room, Mark Doyle sat under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, his arms crossed tightly, his face expressionless. At first, he refused to speak, letting long silences stretch between questions. But after hours of persistence, his wall began to crack. His words came slowly, spoken in a flat and detached tone, as though he were describing something ordinary rather than a crime that had destroyed so many lives. Mark admitted that on that April night in 2008, he had been drinking in his garage. Before driving toward Honeymoon Island, he saw Emily Carter step out of her car with her canvas bag and, on impulse, decided to approach her. He called out, asking if she wanted to walk with him. Emily paused, shook her head, and began to walk faster toward the beach. Her refusal ignited something inside him. A surge of rage he claimed he could not control. He described running toward her, grabbing her arm, and trying to pull her back. Emily resisted, her voice rising in cries for help. In anger and panic, he struck her and then wrapped his hands around her throat until her body went limp. His words painted a picture of violence that investigators had dreaded hearing but could now no longer deny. The details he gave matched the crime scene perfectly. He spoke of dragging Emily toward the bushes, where her jeans tore against the sand and mud, leaving behind the fabric that police had found. He described tossing the jeans aside in fear they might connect him to the crime. He admitted to leaving her car with the keys in the ignition, making it appear as if she had stepped away for only a moment. Every point aligned with evidence that had remained unexplained for 15 years. When asked if he felt regret, Mark simply shrugged and said it happened a long time ago. His chilling lack of remorse was almost worse than the confession itself. To him, Emily's life had ended over a single word, no, and he spoke of it as if it had been nothing more than a passing incident. For Margaret and Thomas Carter, hearing the confession was unbearable. Margaret collapsed into tears, repeating that her daughter had died simply because she refused. Thomas sat in silence, his fists clenched, his face pale with rage and grief. They had waited years for answers, but the truth they finally received was crueler than they had ever imagined. Clearwater now knew what had happened that night. But the horror was far from over. 16 years after the night that shattered Clearwater, the case of Emily Carter finally reached the courtroom. In early 2024, people filled the courthouse, a mix of journalists, community members, and families who had followed the case for years. For the Carters, it was the moment they had waited for, the day they would finally see justice move from words to action. The prosecution laid out the evidence with precision. The torn jeans, preserved for years, carried the DNA that linked directly to Mark Doyle. Investigators walked the jury through the story, showing how genetic genealogy had cracked the case wide open. The discarded soda can, the perfect DNA match, and above all, Mark's own words in the interrogation room painted a picture too clear to ignore. The jury listened as detectives read his chilling confession, recounting how Emily's refusal had cost her life. The defense attempted to fight back. They argued that the confession had been coerced, that detectives had pushed Mark until he spoke. They questioned the reliability of genealogy, calling it too experimental, but their arguments carried little weight when stacked against the physical evidence and Mark's own calm and detailed description of that night. Witnesses also remembered his suspicious presence during the searches, pretending to help the very community he had deceived. For days, the courtroom held its breath, each piece of evidence tightening the noose around Mark Doyle's story. When the closing arguments ended, the jury left to deliberate. Hours passed, but the verdict came swiftly. Mark Doyle was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, his voice steady and resolute, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the words fell, Margaret clutched her husband's hand and whispered a prayer through her tears. The room was heavy with both relief and sorrow. For the Carters, justice had finally been spoken, but it was justice that came too late to save the daughter they loved. Their hearts would never be whole again, but at least they no longer lived in the dark. Emily's story had been given truth, and her memory was no longer haunted by unanswered questions. Clearwater too breathed a sigh of relief. The shadow that had lingered for years had been lifted, though the scars remained. The name of Emily Carter would forever echo through the town as both a tragedy and a reminder of the power of persistence. Yet even with justice served, one question still lingered in the air, one that would haunt everyone who remembered Emily. The trial had closed a chapter, but the story of Emily Carter did not end with the prison walls that confined Mark Doyle. Her name began to live on in ways that carried hope and meaning. The University of South Florida, where Emily had once walked through the halls with dreams of protecting the ocean, announced the creation of the Emily Carter Scholarship. It was built to support marine biology students who, like her, carried a passion for the sea and its fragile life. Each year, a student would now pursue their education with Emily's spirit guiding them forward. Beyond the university, Emily's case became a landmark moment in the state of Florida. It showed the true power of forensic genealogy, a tool once considered experimental but now recognized as a lifeline for justice. Investigators across the state pointed to Emily's case as proof that old evidence could still speak, that forgotten cases could be reborn with the help of science. It sparked conversations in police departments about the importance of preserving evidence with care, so that no family's hope would be buried with time. For the Carter family, life would never return to the way it had been before April 2008, yet they chose to live with purpose. Margaret and Thomas threw their energy into honoring their daughter's memory. They attended scholarship ceremonies, spoke to young students about Emily's dreams, and stood as quiet advocates for justice. Reform. Emily's younger brother, who had been a child when she vanished, grew up to dedicate his career to law enforcement, inspired by the pain of his family's long fight for truth in Clearwater. A memorial was built near the shore where Emily had spent her final hours. It was a simple stone monument engraved with her name, surrounded by flowers that the community laid throughout the year. People gathered there each April, not only to remember Emily, but to remind themselves that even the darkest secrets could eventually be uncovered. Emily Carter's story was one of tragedy, but it became a story of resilience, of a family's strength, and of a community's unbroken hope. Justice had come slowly, but it had come. And through it all, Emily's light, though extinguished too soon, continued to shine in the lives she touched, and in the voices that still spoke her name. But even with the legacy built, there remains one haunting thought that echoes whenever the waves hit the shore. Emily Carter's story now stands as more than just the memory of a young life taken too soon. It is remembered as both a personal tragedy and a symbol of how justice, no matter how delayed, can still be reached. For her family, the truth brought pain, but it also brought an end to years of haunting silence. For her community, her case became a lesson that darkness can hide for years, but it cannot remain forever. Her story inspired investigators across the country to reopen cold cases, to take another look at forgotten evidence, and to believe that even the smallest detail could change everything. Families who had lived in the shadow of unanswered questions saw hope through Emily's case, proof that perseverance and science together could bring justice. Even after long years of waiting. In Clearwater, Emily is no longer remembered only for the night she disappeared, but for the light she carried in life. People still speak of her kindness, her passion for the sea, and her dream of protecting its fragile beauty. She became a reminder that persistence matters, that no voice should fade without being heard, and that the fight for justice must never be abandoned, no matter how much time has passed. And so, Emily Carter's story closes with a message that cuts deep. Justice may come late, but it must always be pursued. Her name, her dreams, and her fight live on, not just in the hearts of those who knew her, but in every person who now believes that the truth, no matter how long it hides, will one day rise to the surface. If you are still here watching this story, it means this story deserves your like and your subscribe. Please help me complete 5,000 likes on this story because this is a challenge from my mother. So help me guys, it is totally free. And tell me in the comments from which city you are watching this story.